If you have your Bibles, you're welcome to turn to Matthew 19. The laborers in the vineyard is actually in chapter 20, the beginning of chapter 20, but it'll be helpful to get a little bit of context. In Matthew 19, 16 through 22, we have the rich young man who comes up to Jesus and says, what must I do to obtain eternal life? And Jesus says, obey the commandments. And he says, I've done that. What am I still lacking? And Jesus says, well, if you want to be complete, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor. And then come and follow me. And you do that so you'll have treasure in heaven. When the young man heard this statement, he went away grieved, for he was one who owned much property. Okay? And so then Jesus tells his disciples, hey, it's really hard for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Right, now, how many of you have heard that the eye of the needle was the little side gate beside the big gate, and camels would have to kneel down across? There's no evidence for that. People just came up with that because they thought, well, he couldn't really mean go through the eye of a needle because that would be impossible. Well, that's what he meant. That's the point. It wasn't this little side gate. Again, we have no evidence that was ever called the eye of a needle. So when the disciples heard this, they're very astonished. They said, well, then who can be saved? And Jesus, looking at them, said, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And then Peter, good old Peter, speaks up, well, hey, we left everything and followed you. What is there going to be for us? And Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that you who have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or farms for my name's sake shall receive many times as much and shall inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Okay? And then he tells this parable. All right? And how does he start? For. What does for mean? For means that what comes next is in some way explaining or proving what has come before. All right? But it could be an example. It could be a proof. It could be let me explain it a little bit more. But it's somehow kind of buttressing. How do we know that what I just said is true? Well, here's some answer. Okay? So he makes this claim that many who are first will be last and the last first, and then he jumps into this parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Again, he went out about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day long? They said to him, because no one hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first. When those hired about the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. When those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. But he answered and said to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious, or literally, is your eye evil because I am generous? So, the last shall be first, and the first last. Okay? Now, what is the point of this parable? Is the point that everyone gets the same reward? So there's no differentiation in the kingdom. Does that seem just? I know what you want to say, and then you think, this is the Bible, so it's got to be right? Right? I mean, let's assume you work for Amazon, okay? You start January 1. And you work all year, and then on December 1st, they hire a bunch of seasonal workers to handle the big Christmas rush, all right? And then at the New Year's Eve party, Jeff Bezos gets up and says, we got great news. It was a banner year for us. We brought in so much money that we're able to pay all of our seasonal workers the full yearly rate, as if they'd worked all year. Now, how's that going to make you feel? Like, I am so glad I work for such a generous boss, right? No, you're going to think, why in the world did I work all year when I could have just come and worked for a month, right? And you would feel that your work was being devalued, right? My work is only worth 1/12 as much as theirs. Well, we do have this, the last shall be first and the first last, right? Which Matthew has framed this parable around, right? How many of you, when you heard this parable, thought, the point is the first shall be last and the last first? No. There is, this little plot twist here that he begins with the last group, but that's a minor point that's necessary in order to set up the tension where they think they're going to get a lot more, right? So a form critic looking at this would say, this parable isn't about the last shall be first and the first last. That's obviously a Matthean addition. So we can strip that part out. That was not part of what Jesus said when he originally told this. Okay? So what happened was Matthew saw there was this little last to first action and read it kind of superficially and thought, oh yeah, this would be good to illustrate that, and plugged it in. All right? So we can strip that away. All right? Does that make sense? Was there anything else that was curious about this parable? And we'll come back to the question of what it means. Well, how many groups get sent into the vineyard? 5, right? The original group, and then after 3 hours, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour, right? And they all get sent into the vineyard. How many groups get paid? 2. What happened to the other 3 groups? And it's not like you can really assume that, well, they're just not mentioned. Because if the first group saw everybody going up and getting a denarius, then they wouldn't be surprised when they get up there and get the same thing. They might still be angry, but it wouldn't be a shock. Right? So how many groups do you need to have the meat of the parable? Well, only 2. You need the first group and the last group. So the form critic would say, those middle groups, that's a later addition. Strip that out, because that wouldn't have been part of the original story. How do we know? Because they don't show up in the second half. All right, does that make sense? You see how form critics are approaching this? They look for tensions and things that don't quite fit, and then say, the answer is to strip them out because somebody added that in later. Because remember, for the original form critics, every story starts out in its pure, simplest form. And then other stuff gets added as time goes on. Okay? And then what they do is once you get down to the pure original story, then you can ask, well, what might Jesus have meant by this story? Which, for the form critic, is often going to be different than what the evangelist wants the story to illustrate. Okay? But let's go back to what this story is really trying to illustrate. What is the point? Okay, right. So hey, look, I fulfilled our agreement. You said you'd do this for a denarius, and I gave you a denarius. So what's your issue? Right? Is that a very satisfying answer? No. If someone hires a man for a position and pays him $100,000, then hires a woman for the position and pays her $75,000, and then she finds out and says, well, wait a minute, what's up with this? He said, well, look, I paid you what it was agreed, so everything's good, right? Well, hopefully there's something. No, there's something not quite right about that. Even if you can point to the legality of just because something is legal doesn't make it right. And when they address this concern that, hey, we work the whole day and you're paying us the same as the guys who came in at the last hour. he seems to kind of get out by pointing to the legality of it. Well, look, I can do this. It's legal. But that doesn't address the underlying complaint, right?
So can I take a stand?
Sure.
For me, it would be that even though I may have labored in the vineyard or worked for Christ longer than you, then at the end of the day, we will all be rewarded the same.
Okay, good. And that's the way this is often interpreted. Again, does that seem just? And if that's the image of God that we're putting forth when we interpret this parable, how's that going to seem to people who are out there? Is God a righteous God?
It would be good for somebody that's been out there for a long time and just decided to come in.
Okay, but what about those who've been working in the field for a long time?
But it's just like he said, it's like he told the disciples, it's like you chose this. You signed up for it. So don't worry about, my pastor preaches, keep your eyes on your own stuff. Okay? Look over here.
Right? And we do get, is your eye evil? Do you know what the evil eye was in the ancient world? The evil eye was whenever somebody would look at you with jealousy. It would unleash bad forces to bring you bad luck and bad fortune. Right? And so that's why, you would never boast about your children, or you try to make them look as ugly as you could, and because you didn't want people to look at you with envy. You didn't want them to look at you with the evil eye, because then that would just invite bad stuff to happen to you. Okay? So is your eye evil because I am generous? I was generous to these last people. Are you now looking at them with envy and inviting bad stuff to come upon them? You'll often hear this parable is about grace, right? Along the lines that you said, whether you come in at the beginning or at the end, everybody gets the same because it's all about grace. But this parable is not, there is no grace in this parable. Right? Everybody works in this parable. Grace is about what you get for not working. Everybody in this parable works. The guy isn't going out on the street and saying, here, have $10 for you and $15 for you, and no, everybody is working in the field for at least some portion of time. This parable is about what constitutes just compensation. It's not about grace. And by the way, who does the landowner seem to represent here? Who does the landowner usually represent in parables? God, right? So this isn't just a matter of well, he thinks he's right. I mean, and you've got some commentators that find the landowner's actions here so problematical, they'll say this isn't God. This is, something else. Okay, so what is the view that makes what this person does right?
The fact that he actually paid them. Because there have been some passages that, the wages for the laborer are due and they haven't been paid. So the fact that he actually was forthright in paying them.
Okay. Well, let me give you another scenario, because there's some commentators say, okay, you want to feel the injustice of this parable? Well, who are the ones that go out and start early in the morning? Well, those are the African Americans. They have to work the whole day. And who comes in at the 11th hour? Well, those are the white guys. And then everybody gets paid the same. Great. Isn't that just? He meets his obligation to each group in terms of what he said he would give them. I don't think anybody, the last group certainly isn't going to say, hey, you didn't give me what was right. Right? I mean, they're going to be thrilled. Hey, I got a whole day's pay. Great. Right? But what makes that just? Because again, I mean, we recognize in this country that if you have people doing the same work, they have the same level of experience, they should get paid the same thing. And even if, because you go in secret and set up your negotiations with each one gets paid a whole lot more than another, that's not just, even if you got them to agree to it. Right? And that's why you have lawsuits and things like that about workplace discrimination and things like that. Is the United States more just than God? That's a scary thought.
I still want to go back to the fact that he actually fulfilled the agreement, that he paid them something, that he actually paid them.
Okay, but do you understand why these guys are upset?
Yeah.
Do you think they have a case?
I don't think so.
Because it's said that the landowner made the one that came in at the last hour equal to them. And they had been out in the heat, in the scorching heat all day.
I was gonna say, but he still abided by what he said, he gave them what he promised.
He did, and again, that's what he points out. Hey, I gave you what I promised. This is all above board, but it's not a question of legality. Yeah, he can do this. Everybody agrees you can do this. But it still leaves a really bad taste in the first group's mouth. Right? Because they had to work a full 12-hour day out in the hot sun. And when you compare, what they harvested versus what those who came in at the 11th hour harvested, I mean, it's going to be like no comparison. Right? We did a lot more work for you, and yet we got paid exactly the same. This is about what constitutes just compensation. And here's the point I would suggest. Why is the 11th, what does he say to the group that he sends in at the 11th hour? Why have you been standing here idle all day long? And what is their answer? Because no one hired us, right? When did they show up to work?
Probably the 10th hour.
Well, no, because they've been there all day long doing nothing, right? They did. They showed up the same time as the first group, but they weren't picked. Maybe they were the wrong gender. Maybe they were the wrong color. Maybe they were the wrong age. Maybe they weren't quite as strong. Whatever the reason was, they got overlooked and someone else got picked and sent to the vineyard. And then more employers came. They got overlooked again and again and again. And an hour before the day is over, they're still standing there hoping to at least get an hour's worth of work. Right? This is the point of the parable, I would suggest. God is not going to penalize you for work that you were not given the opportunity to do. Yeah. The landowner effectively started the clock the same time that when they showed up for work, just like he did for the others. Right? And he's not going to penalize them because they were not given the opportunity to go work. So this is not about devaluing the value of the first group. It's about revaluing the value of the last group's work. Does that make sense? And he honors them in two ways. One, by paying them for the full day, saying, look, your time is as valuable as the other person's. They got to go spend it in the field. You had to spend it, standing around doing nothing, just waiting. And then he also honors them by paying them first. So this isn't about bringing down, it's about leveling things back up. Right? Now remember, what was it that led into this? Well, Peter's question about, well, hey, what about us? Right? Well, how does this respond to that? Those of us in this room are like those who are being called in at the 11th hour. Right? There is no way our contributions will be able to match the sheer numbers of the first generation. Right? I mean, the original apostles, Peter, Paul, they wrote letters that are still producing fruit. Right? There's no way we can match that because we don't have the same time. We've effectively, got an hour, whereas they've had a full 12. And the message is, that's okay. You be faithful to show up when I need you, and I will make sure you get what is right. I'm not going to penalize you because you didn't get to start back in the first century. Now, something else you see in this parable is that how you see is very much related to how you relate to money. And this is a common theme in Matthew. Okay? Flip back to the Sermon on the Mount for a minute. Matthew 6, 19 to 24. It says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." All right? So here you have two sayings about money, mammon, riches, bracketing one about eyes and how you see, right? What is the point of the first one? What does he say? Where are you supposed to store up treasure? In heaven. Why? Because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Well, why is that important? Where are your spiritual eyes, biblically speaking? In your heart. In your heart. Why is it important that your heart be located in heaven? We need our hearts to be in heaven so that what we're taking in through our spiritual eyes is from heaven's perspective. That's why he immediately goes into, your eye is the lamp of your body. If your heart is in heaven, then what you're going to be seeing is light. But if your heart is down here, what you're going to be taking in is darkness. Right? If your view of situations down here is shaped by our current media and all the stuff that you hear and see from down here, you're going to be dispirited and discouraged and wanting to give up all the time. That's why he says you got to store up treasure in heaven. Because what does it take to get your heart in heaven? Your treasure up there has to be greater than your treasure down here. Why? Because if your treasure down here is greater, that's where your heart's going to be. This is why Jesus, remember what led up to all this? It was the rich young guy. And what does Jesus tell him to do? Well, go sell what you have, reduce your earthly treasure, give to the poor. Sermon on the Mount says that's one of the ways you store up treasure in heaven, along with prayer and fasting. And he says, then you will have treasure in heaven. Well, why is that important? So then your heart will be able to, see from heaven's perspective. Right? That's why he said, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's because absolute numbers don't matter. It's not that, once you hit $1 million, now you're rich and you can't. No, it's about the relative size of your treasure. Whether your treasure up there is greater than your treasure down here. Right? He also says it's those who are pure in heart who will see God. There again, relating heart to what you see. Paul in Ephesians also says, the eyes of your heart might be opened. Okay? So what's the problem here? This first group is looking with eyes that are locked in down here. And from an earthly perspective, this seems incredibly unfair. But if you could see it from heaven's perspective and understand what the landowner was doing and why he was doing it, then it makes a lot more sense. So I would suggest this parable is about how God responds to social injustice. And I would also suggest that we're heading towards payday. And when God institutes payday, he begins with those who have been held down in society to level things back up. But when that happens, there are going to be a lot of people that don't understand what's going on and get very angry and frustrated. Right? Hopefully now you can understand why. Not excuse it, but understand why. Right? And if you can understand, then you're in a position where you can say with Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There is a flip side to this as well. The first group did have to labor all day for what they got. Right? And so it would be just as unjust for the last group to come and start demeaning their work. Right? And saying, well, why are you so upset? We had to stand there all day, and we see this response too. It's the you didn't build that response, right? Because you got a leg up. You got $1 million seed money to start your business. Well, okay, yeah, I would love to have $1 million seed and start my own business too. But you still got to work with that. Right? You still got to put in the hours and build the company, and you still got to work to get the paycheck at the end. So hopefully what this parable helps us to do is see, whichever side you find yourself on, an ability to at least see where the other side is coming from and to understand kind of their perspective. And to remember that we need to be storing up treasure in heaven if we want to have true discernment as to what's actually going on down here on earth.